Hi there, I'm Renos Vakis, lead economist at the World Bank, and your host for Accelerating Development Ideas for Impact. This is not your typical podcast. It's an AI powered conversation brought to you by the World Bank Institute for Economic Development, where we unpack the latest research with one goal in mind, turning big ideas into real world impact. Let's get started.
Thank you for the introduction, Renos. Imagine the poles are standing, the wires are connected, and the investment has been announced. But when the sun goes down, some homes are still dark. That's where the real story begins, not with construction, but with whether electricity truly becomes part of everyday life.
Exactly. Across Africa, access to reliable and affordable energy remains a major development challenge. Despite growing investment and resources, many households and businesses still face outages, limited connectivity, or electricity that is too expensive to use regularly, holding back productivity and opportunity.
In this Research Currents, Africa's Energy series, we explore what rigorous economic research reveals about closing the gap between infrastructure and real, reliable, and productive access to electricity. In this first episode, we examine why major investments in electricity infrastructure do not always translate into real access, drawing on new research on pricing, affordability, and household demand across Africa.
For the last decade, we have seen a surge in investment in African electricity infrastructure. Governments, development partners, the private sector, everyone is putting capital into the system. But here is the friction point. In many contexts, the connections just aren't following the money as fast as we expected.
That's the investment outcome gap we're discussing today, right? Because looking at the International Energy Agency's reporting, they say universal access is technically achievable. But then we look at this new wave of academic evidence from 2024 and 2025, and it paints a much more complex picture. It seems like access isn't just about bolting a wire to a house.
It is not. The evidence suggests that access is not a one time event where you flip a switch and walk away. Access is a monthly financial commitment. The core thesis emerging from these papers is that we cannot achieve universal access through infrastructure alone. We have to align our financing with the reality of how households actually behave.
So it's not just about connections?
No, it is about pricing, demand, and reliability. We are seeing that demand is incredibly sensitive to usage costs and income constraints. If we don't get the pricing model right, the infrastructure sits there unused.
Well, let's dive into the evidence, because there are four specific case studies here that really break this down. The first one comes from Togo in 2025. It deals with something I think policymakers often overlook, the difference between the cost to connect and the cost to use the power.
This is a critical distinction. Usually, governments focus on subsidizing the extensive margin, the upfront cost of the solar kit or the grid meter. They assume that if you give someone the hardware, they will naturally find the money to keep the lights on.
But the Togo data says otherwise?
Completely otherwise. In this study, they tested a subsidy that didn't touch the upfront cost at all. Instead, they reduced the ongoing usage price of solar energy, basically the daily fee, by roughly 17 to 42%, depending on the system size.
And what was the uptake?
It was dramatic. That usage price reduction led to a 240% increase in the adoption of small solar systems in the first 5 months of the subsidy.
240% just by lowering the daily rate?
Yes, the elasticity of adoption was estimated at negative 4.1. In plain English, that means a 10% drop in price could increase adoption by over 40%. Even starting from low baseline adoption, that kind of elasticity is extraordinary.
That's massive. It implies that households are doing some pretty sophisticated long-term math. They aren't just looking at the entry fee, they're calculating, can I afford this next month and the month after?
Exactly. High usage prices are a primary barrier. If the daily cost feels like a burden, people won't sign up, even if the connection itself is free.
So, affordability is king. But that leads us to another theory people often have, that the problem isn't only about the amount of money people have, but when they have it. The liquidity issue.
Right. The idea that households are cash poor at the moment they need to buy electricity credits. This brings us to the second paper, based in Rwanda. They ran a randomized controlled trial to test this liquidity constraint hypothesis.
How did they test it?
They offered households a line of credit, basically, use the power now, pay us back later. It solved the cash flow problem and reduced the hassle of running to a vendor.
I assume people loved that.
Well, about 20% of customers used the credit, proving they valued the flexibility. But here is the twist. There was no statistically significant change in the total amount of electricity consumed.
Wait, so making it easier to pay didn't make them use more power?
No. And that is a crucial insight for policymakers. Market frictions like liquidity are not the main thing dampening demand. The binding constraint is fundamental affordability, income levels. You can make the payment mechanism as smooth as you want, but if the household simply doesn't have the income, consumption won't budge.
That clears up a lot of confusion. We can't just fintech our way out of poverty constraints. Okay, so we've looked at pricing and liquidity on the usage side of things, but what about the decision to take up the technology itself? I know there's often a debate between extending the main grid versus using off-grid solar. A study from Kenya really highlights how people feel about this.
This is the hierarchy of demand. The Kenya study reveals a massive preference gap. Rural households value the grid connection significantly higher than solar home systems because of the capacity and reliability.
I see the numbers here. The mean willingness to pay for the grid was about $78, compared to just $43 for off-grid solar. That's nearly double.
It is. People know the grid can run a fridge or heavy machinery, while solar often cannot. But here is the tragedy of the market. $78 is still far too low to cover the actual cost of connecting a rural home to the grid.
And for the poorest families, that $78 is a fortune. The study mentions it would consume over 8% of their annual expenditure.
Exactly. So you have this situation where people want the grid, but they cannot afford the entry ticket. However, this study did find a policy mechanism that helped. When they extended payment periods, switching from a lump sum to installments, acceptance rates for grid connections jumped from 50% to nearly 75%. So credit does seem to help households afford the big upfront costs of getting connected, even though in Rwanda it didn't shift usage.
That connects the dots for me. If the grid is the premium product, financing helps people access it. But we have to recognize that for the very poorest, even installments might not be enough.
Which brings us to the most difficult context of all, fragile settings. The fourth paper looks at refugee settlements in Zambia, Malawi, and Uganda.
This feels like the ultimate stress test for these theories. We're talking about populations with extreme income constraints.
We are. And the data shows that income is the strict cap on demand. Households are generally willing to pay about 10% of their monthly income for reliable electricity. But because incomes vary so wildly, the absolute numbers are all over the place.
Yeah, I see here that in Maheba, Zambia, the willingness to pay was $36 a month. But in Ajumani, Uganda, it was only $8 a month. That's a huge disparity.
It is, and it is also driven by stability in addition to income. In older settlements like Meheba, where people have lived for years, they are willing to invest more. Reliability is the key driver: safety, lighting, security. But in places like Ajumani, 28% of respondents had a willingness to pay of zero.
Zero?
Zero. It signals a total inability to pay, not a lack of desire. And interestingly, Receiving humanitarian aid was actually negatively correlated with willingness to pay.
Really? You'd think aid would give them a buffer to buy power.
You would think so, but in this data, aid status acts as a proxy for extreme poverty. If you are receiving aid, it is because you are the most vulnerable. It reinforces that without deep, targeted support, market based electricity solutions just won't reach these groups.
So, putting all four of these papers together, Togo, Rwanda, Kenya, and the refugee context, it feels like we need a major shift in how we think about investing in access. It's not just build it and they will come.
It is certainly not. We need to move beyond a supply side mindset. The evidence from Togo tells us that long term affordability matters, not just a connection fee. Rwanda tells us that convenient credit isn't a magic wand for low incomes.
And Kenya shows us that people want the grid, but we need realistic payment models to make it happen.
Exactly. And for the off grid sector, we must accept that solar is often the only financially viable option for the poorest quintiles. But even that requires subsidy design that reflects their reality. We cannot expect a refugee in Uganda to pay market rates for a solar home system when their willingness to pay is $8 a month.
So, the path forward isn't stopping investment, but getting smarter with it?
That is the perfect way to put it. To close the gap between investment and access, policy has to shift to the demand side. This is exactly what the IEA warned about. Financing gaps are only part of the story. If pricing and demand aren't aligned, capital alone won't deliver universal access. We need to ensure reliability because that drives value, and we need to design affordability into the system from day one. And where the data and delivery systems allow it, governments can target public spending toward the most vulnerable households, which is why investing in good data systems is so important to ensure resources are used efficiently. When we align the financing with the human reality of the user, that is when access finally follows investment.
That's a powerful place to leave it, aligning the finance with the human reality.
It is the only way forward. Over to you, Renos.
Thank you for joining us. You can find the full report on our website. Just follow the link in the description. Be sure to subscribe to be the first to know about upcoming episodes. And before you go, how do you plan to put what you learn into practice? And what topics you'd like us to explore next? We'd love to know. Until then, goodbye.